Welcome to WBC Faster Together, the LinkedIn Live series of the Women Business Collaborative. I'm Gwen Young, Chief Operating Officer of the WBC, and today my co-host and WBC Advisory Council member, Linda Peekshot, is joined by Dr. Ellen Snee, author of Lead, How Women in Charge Claim Their Authority. WBC is an unprecedented alliance of over 71 women business organizations and hundreds of business leaders building a movement to achieve equal position, pay, and power for all women in business. Through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability, we are mobilizing thousands to create momentum and accelerate the pace of change. Led by WBC founder and CEO Edie Frazier, the WBC has a diverse board of directors, advisory and leader councils, and includes more than 34% people of color. Please check the chat for our 9 action initiatives and join our movement at wbcollaborative.org and register for our upcoming forum on May 11th, Rethinking and Accelerating Diversity and Women's Leadership in Business. Each week in this series, we offer different ways to advocate change by presenting data, research, and best practices, by lifting up the power of women's voices for change, and by showcasing the importance of cross-generational collaboration and the allyship of men in the movement. So Linda, let's get started.
Thanks, Gwen. Well, for our monthly look at building power through women's vision and voice, I am so honored to welcome Dr. Ellen Snee, the author of Lead, How Women in Charge Claim Their Authority. Before writing the book, Ellen had already impacted hundreds of women as she worked as an executive coach and in multiple settings from her years as a nun in corporate America and as an inspiring speaker. Ellen, welcome.
Linda, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be able to talk with women who are making a difference for other women.
Yes, well, that's certainly what the WBC is. And before we get to the specific, very compelling lessons from your book, let's look at one woman whose life was celebrated in Washington yesterday, Madeleine Albright. As I read your book, I thought of her as a role model for so many of the things you suggest on claiming your authority. What's your take on Madeleine Albright's leadership?
It was such a joy last night to watch. I had taped it to watch the memorial. She is such an inspiration to all of us. I think in light of our conversation today, there are a few things I'd highlight. One is that she never took herself too seriously. She had a fabulous sense of humor and was up to dancing the Macarena as quickly as talking to world leaders. And I think today, with a lot of discussion about imposter syndrome and authenticity, I've been concerned about that for women. And Madeleine is a perfect example of how to be totally yourself with other world leaders, dancing the Macarena, or calling one of her daughters every night at 6:35. She did it all, but she never took herself too seriously. And I think that's a real lesson. She also built phenomenal relationships, from family to friends to world leaders. And yesterday was a testimony to that. And finally, she invested in her brilliant mind to be able to bring to world leadership insights, and not only insights, but she knew how to speak up and speak out. Hillary Clinton described her, standing upright. I don't know, she was like 5'2" or 5'4". But what I remember are her pins, that she was someone who used symbols and any opportunity to communicate a message. And finally, the thing I loved about her was she knew how to interrupt. And that's a
Yes.
skill I'm still working on. But I think women who know how to interrupt get further and get more. So those are the things I take from Madeleine.
That's great. And that was one of the things that she taught her students, right? To learn to interrupt. You know, that takes us to a section that's in the middle of your book, but very important, I think, for our audience to hear about. And that is executive presence. And you hit three things, you hit several things, but three things that really struck me was avoid tentative language, recognize the power of little words, reclaim gravitas. Can you talk a little bit about those three?
Sure. In part, that chapter was to try to also address what women have been told about executive presence as simply about how you dress and show up and appear, kind of the externals, which are certainly important, as Madeleine's pins communicated. But I think what I have found over time is that women have the power to change their language, and often their language does them in. So I give an example in the book, or when I'm talking to people, about women who say, could I ask you a question? Or I just want to come and see if we could find a way. And there are all these phrases before you get to the heart of it. And we've got to learn how to take those out. We've got to just go for it. Are you available? Could we do this? We also have to learn how to avoid being tentative by having a point of view. By having a point of view going into a meeting will make it easier to speak up early and often. I encourage my clients to try to be the first one to speak, because if you're someone who's hesitant, hearing your own voice and others hearing you makes it much easier to continue to be part of the conversation. But having a point of view, women do their homework. They have thoughts on the topic, but they self-silence. And I can hear people saying, oh, no, I get cut off. And I say, yes, and you fail to push yourself, to interrupt, to get your point of view out. And so I think there are many, I tried in the book to talk about things that women could actually do themselves, rather than talking about all the things that make it hard. And I think the area of language is something that I am vehement about. I'm always interrupting women to say, I think you want to say it a different way.
Well, that's right. And that leads to gravitas, right? Something that Madeleine Albright had. And if you follow, and I encourage people to get the book, if you follow the suggestions that you make throughout the book, but especially in that chapter on executive presence, I think you'll see yourself reclaiming gravitas.
Mm-hmm.
You studied with Carol Gilligan, who many of our audience may not know, but can you explain a little bit why what you found with her research is still evident today?
Yes. I went to Harvard in order to work with her, because her book, In a Different Voice, I read it pounding the table saying, yes, this is what I want to talk about. Because up until then, most, if not all, of the psychology literature and business literature had been written by men for men. And Carol began to interview women about moral dilemmas. And as she did, she heard what she describes as a different voice of human experience. She heard a voice that got categorized as the voice of care, the voice of connection, the voice of community. I think what her work has led to in my work is that I encourage women to listen to themselves and to each other, and to try to emphasize what they know to be true. Because in her research on girls, she found that around the age of 12, girls lose touch with what they know. And if you have a 9-year-old daughter or neighbor or cousin, you know they have more voice than we do. But something happens as they grow into the culture. And that's what we have to undo. We have to undo the impact on the culture that has led us to self-silence.
Well, let's talk about how we do that, because you look at the relational nature of women's leadership, and you look at it through a lens of through a framework of 3 things. Can you talk about that? Self and
Sure.
other and system?
Sure. Let me say a word first about how I came to the framework. While I was at Harvard working with Carol, I also took a very popular course on leadership that was at the Kennedy School. And the professor kept talking about the importance of listening and of communicating and of hearing what the other person did and working collaboratively. And I have to say, I sat there thinking, I came to Harvard for this, because I had, as a nun, lived and worked with amazing women from around the world who ran universities and colleges and high schools and nonprofits. And they were as different as day and night, but they knew how to mobilize people. They knew how to listen. They knew how to be inclusive. And so it led me to say, all right, if this isn't going to be useful for women, what is? And that led me to ask, what is it like for women in roles of authority? And as I interviewed and analyzed the interviews and wrote about it, I came to see that for women, it's all about relationships, but not just one-on-one, not just me and Linda. It begins with yourself. That very often women have been so busy caring for people, their family, their neighbors, their direct reports, that they haven't spent time listening to their inner voice. And that's where you can begin to catch all of the language you use that I just referred to, the self-silencing and the limiting and the tentative language. But you have to begin by understanding what you want. What is your deep desire? When I ask men, what is it they want next in their career? They always know. And it's often their boss's job or their boss's boss's job. But for many years, when I asked women the same question, they really didn't know. And we have to know if we're going to be effective. The second is about relationships, but we know women are great at relationships. And in fact, there's research that during the pandemic, women leaders, women managers were the ones who really paid attention and cared for their direct reports, which is probably linked to the exit and the burnout that we're seeing today. But women fail to pay attention to those who are in executive roles. So they fail to, I always say women work like this, focused on their work and focused on their team, but they don't spend enough time looking out across their organization and particularly up at the executive team. And so those in executive roles are not in a position to promote them because they don't know them. So we have to find ways, and I know it's uncomfortable for women that they think they're just, kissing up, and you gotta find a way to do it, even if it feels uncomfortable, because that's how you are promoted. And finally, the place where I think women really need to do more work is in understanding systems. And that's where Madeleine is such a good example. Madeleine saw how fascism could come back, and we're seeing that now. Madeleine understood that working for good and making a difference is not something at the individual or relationship level. We have to understand systems. And women in organizations who understand the culture and understand the underlying dynamics of a company are much more effective than those who don't. You know, they say culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we as women need to pay more attention to the culture. So it's all three, all at once, all the time.
Well, let's go from self, others, and systems to the other model you use, and that is for the way that you look at the women's development is recognize, discern, and act. You know, discernment is not something that we spend a lot of time talking about. So why did you include that?
So as a nun, everything is about discernment. As a nun, you spend your life praying and reflecting on what is God's desire. And some of my classmates currently, I'm in a program on advanced leadership, and some of them have a very strong spiritual background and talk that way all the time. Like, what is it that God wants me to do? As a nun, that was central. And we would pray and we would share our thoughts. When I left my community and moved into the corporate sector, I realized that the same dynamic was not only possible, but important. And what I mean by it outside of a religious framework is really focusing on your inner truth, taking the time that's equivalent to praying, taking the time in reflection, in meditation, in thinking and journaling to know what you're called to, what's going on, and what that means for what you're going to do. And finding people in your life, whether a community or a mentor or a friend, to process that, to get another perspective. So discernment is really key. And there's a lot about mindfulness today, and people do Zen, but I want to say it's a little bit more. It's about where you're being called to make a difference in the future and how to clarify that.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that. You follow that up with act. And I know that's, you know, common sense. Okay, yes, you know, after you figure out what you want to do, you act. But you devote quite a bit of time to focusing on the actual move to action. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I'd say two things about that. The first is that I learned long ago that if we're going to take an action or make a change, there are really three steps. The first is you have to recognize what's going on. You have to recognize and identify the opportunity or more often the challenge. And then I tell my clients, don't try to jump in and change it immediately. Just become aware of it in the moment and slowly but surely introduce a new behavior. And then as you begin to build that muscle, you can really take action. The second thing I would say is in writing the book, I wanted it to really be something that was very useful, something that could be a constant companion, sit at your bedside, and you could use any chapter on a given issue. And so I came up with 4 steps that I outline at the end of each chapter. The first is, and I tried to link them to the letters LEAD, which no one seems to have noticed, despite all the challenge of finding the right words. The first one is to learn. That if we're going to make a difference on something, we need to learn more about it. You know, if I'm going to commit to exercise, I need to learn what kind of exercise and where I can do it. I need to learn more about the topic. The second is engage. It's the discernment. It's the engaging others in the dialogue to improve your grasp and to move it forward. And the third in the book I talk about as activate, which is to come up with a plan, to really map it out, to figure out what you're going to do. And business has lots of those plans. And then finally, do it. I think very often that we can seek to be perfect and seek to get the perfect plan when we've got to be more like Madeleine and just be in a hurry to get it done. I often tell my clients that, especially the ones who are pressed for time, that you're probably spending 150% on what you're doing, and just cut back to 100, because you're still going to be ahead of many of your colleagues who are working at 80%. So shoot for 100% and you're going to be fine.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ellen. And I have to say, we could talk for another hour, and maybe you will come back and talk to us about your chapter on how women in charge lead other women.
I would love that.
Yeah, but for today, we have to say that this is a wrap, and we want to thank you for being with us and thank our audience, and suggest that with Mother's Day coming up, with graduations coming up, the book Lead: How Women in Charge Claim Their Authority by Dr. Ellen Snee would make a great gift. So Gwen, take us out. Who do we have next week?
That's fantastic. Well, actually, next week we have Edie Frazier and Andy Simon to talk about our May 11th forum, which is that 3.5-hour forum, Ellen, where we've got 27 panelists across 3 tracks, talking about rethinking and accelerating women's leadership business. How are we thinking this? How are we actually doing this and driving impact? So I think it will be fantastic and continue the theme. So thanks first to Linda and to Ellen. Thank you both for your time, for your energy, for your advice. Thank you for the audience. We invite you to wbcollaborative.org to learn more about our work to increase women in the C-suite and the boardroom, to address the underrepresentation of women in areas like access to capital and technology, and to advance a pipeline of women leaders to bring gender pay parity and diversity, equity, and inclusion to the business landscape. So join our movement, follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter, and have a great Thursday. Thank you all.